This is the Tory Leadership Election podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home. Welcome to the fifth Tory Leadership Election podcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, with Mark Wallace, executive editor of Conservative Home. And Mark, in the previous 4 weeks, we've started off very predictably with good week, bad week, but that distinction really goes now because we don't have a lot of candidates to explore. We're just going to do Boris Johnson's week and Jeremy Hunt's week. So, Boris Johnson's week, what do you think?
Well, it's been a very Boris week, hasn't it, in many ways? So stately as a galleon, he's kind of continued to do that Boris thing where he sails through quite turbulent waters at times, particularly at the start of this week. There's a huge amount of attention on him, huge amount of flack and speculation and gossip and headlines and about various different things, as well as the most famous story. And he's managed by, I suspect, a combination of kind of lifelong habit, but also of quite solid strategic advice from his team to continue to steam through it, to actually manage to hold that line, which at every stage, people who really, really hate him declare that he can't possibly do X, Y, or Z. He can't possibly get through something in a way that they don't necessarily want, but he keeps on doing it.
Last time we did this podcast was a Friday morning. It obviously goes out on the Saturday. So actually, between us making it and it going out, came the rumpus about his private life, the apparent row with Carrie Symonds, the tape recording that was given to The Guardian and all that. So therefore, I feel he started off his week last Sunday in real difficulty. This story was rolling on and it wasn't apparent what the reaction among Tory members would be. And obviously, for the moment, the reaction that counts most for Boris Johnson is Tory members, not the general public. And I think Camp Johnson really was nervous about it. But the call you made, I think quite rightly, was, look, if you're worried about the safety of a neighbour, you would make an inquiry, you might well make a tape recording, you might well go to the police, but you wouldn't go to The Guardian with a tape. And so it proved to be. I mean, Camp Johnson were very nervous about what happened last weekend. And I know from doing the interview with him, which Andrew Jimson and I carried out on Wednesday, that they were very jittery about the Con Home survey, which they knew was coming. And the Con Home survey duly showed basically nothing very much had changed. Jeremy Hunt has swept up most of the support that party members in the survey were previously giving to Sajid Javid and Michael Gove in the last stages of that parliamentary ballot. But Boris Johnson maintains his lead. He's got a 36-point lead over Jeremy Hunt, according to our survey. He's on about 66%, Hunt's on 30%. So I think his week steadied up. He seems to be enjoying himself more. He even made a few jokes.
Yeah, I think he's been fortunate in some of his critics in that sense, some of the people he's run up against, just as with the BBC debate, when he had quite an awkward moment when questioned by the Imam from Bristol about consequences, whether words have consequences. He was quite fortunate in a sense that the same person had been not very well vetted by the BBC and turned out to be somebody who espoused some pretty unpleasant and controversial views. At the same time, as you say, the behaviour of these neighbours of Carrie Symonds was not to do completely the right thing, to check on a neighbour, to phone the police if you're concerned about them, to record before the police get there. But then it turned out that actually they went rather further than that and behaved in a way that didn't entirely suggest they were motivated purely out of concern. So yeah, I think one thing that's also happened in Boris Johnson's week has been a shift in his campaign structure and its team, as well as in accordance with the change in the campaign. There have been some very interesting looks this week inside that, including by Paul Waugh, who's done some really interesting work looking at how they've changed the importance of different people with different functions, because of course the electorate has now change now that we're out of the parliamentary stage?
That's right. He's got Ian Duncan Smith in as chairman. Mark Fulbrook, Linton Crosby's partner at Crosby Textor Fulbrook, has sort of really taken charge of this stage of the campaign. And I'm told that the kind of official line that Fulbrook is really working on this because Linton Crosby is busy with clients is surprisingly enough actually basically true. Crosby's got a lot of commercial work on, and Fulbrook is running the thing. I think there was an awkward join when they got out of the parliamentary stage that James Wharton and Gavin Williamson ran very well. I think they didn't adjust very well to the next stage. They tried to keep him a bit under wraps. And then he came out after Fulbrook and co got hold of it. This is my reading of events. And he did the BBC interview with Laura Koonsberg. He got about a bit more. He did the interview with us. Lingering on Boris Johnson, I thought what was interesting when Andrew Jimson and I saw him was a couple of things. One was that he did look quite nervous for Boris Johnson. I think he knows that if he wins, he's going into a situation where he's going to have alienated and angry Remain Tory MPs if he moves one way, the way he said he'll go, and he'll have very angry Tory Leave MPs if he goes the other. And although he cracked the odd joke, he didn't follow all our invitations to be the old Boris. So when I raised the very frivolous suggestion he might want to wrestle Jeremy Hunt nude, once upon a time, the old Boris Johnson would have basically said, yes, I'm up for this. I'll fight him anywhere, anytime, in any way. This time he said, well, that's not what I'm planning to do. Although he couldn't resist saying, of course, in any contest of that kind, I'd beat everyone, which, gave the Sun a chance to take our story on and do an illustration of Hunt and Johnson wrestling. But I did detect a touch of nervousness there.
Yes, and I think there are some signs that he's also been allowed out of the coup rather more this week. He's also, I think, in some ways settled a bit more into the theme of being himself. We saw this a little bit with Ross Kempsell's interview with the bus painting, which has hilariously provoked some very fevered conspiracy theories about the idea that actually he's trying to make everyone magically forget other more controversial buses. But one thing he's shown throughout this week is that whether it's always a headline he might like or not, he is the candidate who's dominating the headlines by and large. And if there are headlines coming from the other side, they still tend to be about Boris Johnson.
He is actually, it's almost as though you're living in some sort of universe where Boris Johnson is matter and Jeremy Hunt by definition is antimatter. Everything that he does is seen in the light of what Boris Johnson's doing. I felt myself that Hunt had the opposite week to Johnson. I thought Boris Johnson started off the week in a delicate place and it's basically got better. Jeremy Hunt started off having had really a very good performance in Birmingham. I think the general consensus is he actually did rather better in the Birmingham hustings than Boris Johnson. And he does seem to be enjoying himself. And Tim Montgomery said on our site yesterday, that's Friday as you're listening, listeners, he said, and I thought Tim said it quite shrewdly, Boris Johnson's Twitter is really boring. The campaign's got hold of it. It doesn't say very much other than it's great to be wherever he is, and my policy on Brexit is X. Hunt, by contrast, is rather enjoying himself on Twitter. He tweeted earlier this week when he went to the Isle of Wight, this is the most absurd photo shoot I've ever done. I'm eating ice cream and it's 9:15 in the morning. He's managed to get a sort of personal touch into Twitter, which is the art of the thing. That said, I thought he started off well, but ran into a number of niggles, one of which was appearing to call Leave voters and activists inward-looking Little Englanders, which really wasn't helpful. He got ambushed a bit over Northern Ireland and amnesties. And he ran into a bit of trouble in calling October the 31st an artificial deadline, whereas in fact it's a very real deadline. So really he did, I thought, in the latter part of the week get knocked about a bit.
Yeah, I think he's shown, as we talked about last week, the strategic situation that he finds himself in forces him to do particular things, and it directs him, if he wants to be in with a chance, to do particular things. But it's a bind as well as an opportunity. It includes various different risks. So, as we talked about last week, the short nature of the race before the postal votes go out means that anybody who got through to the final two against Boris Johnson would have to come out swinging hard and early and be quite relentless about it. And that doesn't always come naturally, I think, to Jeremy Hunt, whose colleagues would tell you he's a nice guy, basically. But he's done that a lot. He started the week saying Boris Johnson was cowardly. I think he also used the word pathetic in relation to taking part in debates and so on. He pummeled at him. But the downside of that is it's the only thing you can do to cut through, but it runs the risk that the members, the electorate in this round, think that you're doing too much blue on blue, as you're being too personal. Perhaps you're harming a colleague, or for that matter, you might harm the next Prime Minister if you were to succeed in your strategy to a certain extent. And that's been difficult for him. He didn't have a choice other than to do it. You put your finger on another problem he has, which is that Jeremy Hunt's pitch, very wisely, is that he's the responsible, experienced, kind of cool-headed candidate who's run businesses and various other things, not least the NHS. But he has got a bit of a habit of misspeaking or misjudging how he pitches his messages. We had really early on when he criticised No Deal in the Telegraph, I think in week 1. This week we've seen that implied criticism of Leavers. Team Hunt seemed quite outraged that people have read it this way and they think it's been misrepresented. I read that tweet and thought, you are saying this, you are saying that Leavers essentially want little England, which is not a very wise thing to say with this election.
You know, everyone, when the subject of Tory leadership elections is raised, talk about the problems of being the front runner. Front runner never wins. The front runner trips up. And I remember seeing all this acutely when I was involved in the David Davis campaign in 2005, about which maybe the less said the better. But actually, there are problems about being the number 2 when you get down to 2, because you're behind. And if you're behind, you've got to grab attention. And if you're going to grab attention, you've got to take risks, and some of those risks won't pay off. Furthermore, there's something important here about the length of the contest. I mean, we're now on our 5th podcast. I'm enjoying it all as much as ever. But the fact is, leadership contests are very wearing. They take a long time. You have to go to lots of different places. And really, you are basically in the situation that Mark Harper put himself deliberately in during an earlier stage of the election, where he said, I'm going to have a press conference, come and ask me anything you like. Basically, you can ask them, pretty much, anything you like at some stage or another. You're going to be asked a question you're not ready for. And I kind of felt about Northern Ireland and the IRA and soldiers that here's something that Hunt's not got direct responsibility for in Cabinet, right? He's sitting there at these meetings while it's being discussed, and he's probably got in his mind X% of Foreign Office business, something about his constituency. He's thinking about his domestic life. You can't focus on every aspect of government policy. And basically, he used a very loose form of words. He said, the same, which suggested moral equivalence, which he clearly didn't mean. And this really came back to punish him a bit. And that's the nature of these campaigns. Sooner or later, you're going to make a mistake if you're in the remaining 2, because they're quite long.
Yeah, and it depends. It also depends what kind of candidate you're pitching yourself to be. By contrast, the Daily Mail's splash on Friday, the BBC had, at the Foreign Office's request, allegedly cut out a bit of their behind-the-scenes documentary in which it showed, as the Mail put it, Boris Johnson calling the French turds. I think he might have called Emmanuel Macron's government that word, in which he might have the agreement of various French voters. But if you're a Boris Johnson candidate, you didn't start off pitching that actually you're captain responsibility in every circumstance. So by contrast, that really is the challenge that's being put forward by Jeremy Hunt. for good reason. But I think the penalties, to a certain extent, for being a little bit loose in your language are rather higher, if that's your argument. One thing that is interesting, there hasn't been a huge amount of policy difference that's actually opened up between the candidates. Both want roughly the same kind of eventual Brexit deal as their eventual outcome. The key distinction between them is their own personal backstop to secure it, as in whether they would be willing to leave deal or no deal, do or die, or not. There hasn't actually been the room for Jeremy Hunt to open up much more beyond that, other than the general idea that the implication that he's the grown-up in the room.
Well, that's true over another quite big subject, which has got slightly neglected, which is the economy. I'm not sure this bit got into the interview Andrew and I did, but when I was pressing him about spending control and reform and saying, look, every candidate in this election, pretty much, including you, is promising tax cuts and spending increases. Isn't this all a bit lax? Boris Johnson basically said he thought there was headroom for more spending, which is basically the same position as Jeremy Hunt's. And I said to him, basically what you're saying is it's time for a change of gear. And he agreed. He said it's time for a change of gear. No difference really there at all, as far as I can see, between his position and Jeremy Hunt's.
Yes, and of course behind the scenes of all this, both campaigns are peddling extremely hard to try and actually go and meet the members, because there's inherently a lot of this is air war, a lot of it's happening in the national press. It started happening a bit more in interviews as Boris Johnson's kind of opened up. It's happening in the hustings, but the hustings are staggered throughout the whole race, and actually that's why we've seen the candidates start to go out, including to the Isle of Wight, to meet Tory members at local association events, actually press the flesh.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about next week, because basically we've been through this week. Boris Johnson starts off looking a bit rocky. He seems to have got through it. In Theresa May's famous phrase, nothing really seems to have changed. What do we feel about this week, looking ahead? What have we got to look out for?
The coming week has the crucial days for those party members who haven't made their minds up. A lot of them are expected to choose effectively next week how they are going to vote. Each camp will have their own ideas and assessment of what proportion of Tory members are settled on how they're going to vote and what proportion aren't. But we know from the Conhome survey that it seems that Boris Johnson so far held his lead. That means that time is getting very, very tight for Jeremy Hunt to change minds. The ballots will be sent out by the party on the 4th of July. They'll arrive over the two or 3 days following. I think a lot of people will send them straight back.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we will have another survey on Thursday morning. I'd very much like to know if YouGov, who have a way of suddenly producing these polls of party members, get one out before the end of the contest, because that will be extremely interesting to see. And basically, as we look ahead for this week, really, by the end of this week, the ballot papers will start to go out. So this is kind of like Hunt's last chance to really break through in the next few days, because as we've discussed before on this podcast, by the time you get to the London hustings on, I think, July the 17th, most people will have voted.
By the time of the London hustings, it almost gets too risky to leave it that late to actually send your ballot back to be sure that it'll arrive safely in the post at CCHQ. And, it's interesting, Alex Wickham of BuzzFeed wrote a piece on the insider story of Team Hunt, and he said that they believe that 80,000 Tory members have already made their minds up on how they'll vote. Another 80,000 they think haven't. That might be optimistic from their point of view, but they have to believe it. And if they think that's the case, and if our survey is correct, then they have to massively win among those 80,000 undecideds. They have to absolutely dominate the next week, and that's a huge amount of pressure on them. But it also requires something they so far haven't done.
Yes, and I think because that's relatively unlikely, a lot of conversations already turning, and maybe this is the place to finish off, into not only how the Boris Johnson team is working now, but kind of what a Boris Johnson administration would be like. I was waiting with Andrew Jimson to do the Boris Johnson interview, and a quite well-known supporter of Jeremy Hunt came up and said, to us. I enjoyed your piece on the future Boris Johnson cabinet. Then very much with his tongue in his cheek, I'm looking forward to your one on the Jeremy Hunt cabinet. The point being that he, a Jeremy Hunt supporter, recognised that this is all very unlikely. I think looking ahead, big question about Team Boris Johnson is going to be who's in charge, how's he going to reconcile these different factions and groups within the Johnson camp that want position and want authority and want to be able to do things when he wins. He's got the Gavin Williamson, James Wharton sort of interest group. He's got his old familiar supporters like Conor Burns and Nigel Adams. He's got his team from London. He's got the Vote Leave people milling around. Now, how's he going to get all that into an orderly shape? And in particular, the question about Boris Johnson is he any good at saying no? No, you can't do that. No, I'm not going to appoint you. No, that's ain't going to happen. Because his natural tendency is to try to please and be liked, and party leaders, let alone prime ministers, can't be liked all the time.
That's where the experiences of past campaigns and past administrations that he's been in or that he hasn't been in have to have a big influence on him. I think you saw earlier this week, actually, when the story came out about Ian Duncan-Smith being a kind of chairman role, it was followed by some speculation, fueled by goodness knows whom, that actually that meant Ian Duncan-Smith had executive or policy direction control of the Boris Johnson campaign in some way. And actually, it seems that it was Boris Johnson who came out and actually clarified that and said, no, that isn't the case. He's playing an important role with our campaign, but that's not the same thing as saying he's going to be running, say, Downing Street or the government agenda. The experience of 2016 has already loomed large over his campaign. That's one reason why I think we saw such a carefully buttoned down, meticulous parliamentary stage of this race. But he and his advisors and his team will be watching other experiences. They'll be thinking back, as you say, to London. They'll be looking at what happened when David Cameron took over. They'll be looking as a cautionary tale as to what's happened in Theresa May's premiership, of how you try and balance requiring a very centralised, controlling and controlled team around a prime minister, how you balance that without actually crowding out things like dissenting voices that you need, constructive criticism, various things that simply went wrong within Team May.
I think in summary, we're going to be able to discuss much more of this again next week, because I kind of end up with the thought that we're approaching this stage, as discussed, where the ballots come out. By the time we sit down again next Friday to discuss this, people will be on the verge of voting, and I think there'll be even more discussion, if things haven't changed, about what Boris Johnson's Downing Street, what his administration, what his cabinet is going to look like. As I say, if nothing changes, but of course you never know. So look forward to discussing this all again next week, same time, same channel, as someone or other used to say. Thanks very much.